The saddest thing about being forgotten is that eventually you start forgetting yourself. Grace Bennett woke before sunrise every morning, not because she needed to, but because the forest always spoke loudest before the rest of the world stirred awake. She sat quietly on the edge of her bed and listened. Wind brushed through pine branches outside her small cabin. A creek flowed somewhere beyond the trees, its familiar rhythm guiding her like an old friend. Birds greeted the coming morning one by one. To most people, it was simply another day. To Grace, it was how she saw the world. She had been blind for as long as she could remember. Faces meant nothing to her. Colors existed only as descriptions shared by others. Yet she knew the forest better than anyone in the territory. She could identify neighbors by the sound of their footsteps. She could tell whether rain was coming hours before the clouds arrived. She could recognize a person's mood by the way they opened a door. Life had taught her to listen where others looked. Slowly she rose and reached for the wooden cane resting beside her bed. The cabin was modest, barely 700 square feet, but every shelf, chair, and table existed exactly where she expected. Her fingers traced familiar surfaces as she prepared breakfast. The scent of fresh bread filled the room. Soon afterward, she stepped outside into the cool mountain air. The town of Pine Hollow sat near the edge of the Northern Territory, surrounded by thick forests and rolling hills. Most residents knew Grace. Few truly noticed her. Some pitied her. Others dismissed her entirely. In a pack where strength was admired and status mattered, a blind Omega living alone rarely attracted respect. Grace had learned not to expect it. Yet despite everything, she remained kind. Every morning, she delivered bread to an elderly widow who struggled to leave her home. Every week, she helped organize supplies at the local community center. She remembered birthdays, listened to worries, and offered encouragement even when no one thought to ask how she was doing. That was simply who she was. As she walked through town, several people greeted her politely. A few passed without speaking at all. Grace smiled either way. Near the market square, she overheard a group of young women discussing an upcoming gathering. Excitement filled their voices. Talk of future mates, influential families, and important invitations drifted through the air. Grace continued walking. Those conversations had never included her. She had accepted that long ago. Around noon, she visited the community center carrying a basket of baked goods. The building buzzed with activity. Volunteers moved supplies while children played nearby. Grace spent several hours helping organize donations. She worked carefully, counting boxes by touch and arranging shelves through memory. Many people appreciated her help. Few stayed to talk afterward. By late afternoon, the center had emptied. Grace gathered her things and began the walk home. The forest greeted her once more. Leaves rustled overhead. The familiar scent of pine filled the air. Yet something felt different. She slowed her pace. Listened. Somewhere far ahead, deeper among the trees, she heard a sound that did not belong. Not an animal. Not the wind. Footsteps. Heavy. Unsteady. A stranger. Grace stopped completely. The forest grew quiet around her. The footsteps continued for a few seconds, then disappeared. Her heart beat faster. Pine Hollow rarely saw outsiders. Whoever was out there did not belong. For reasons she could not explain, a strange feeling settled over her. Not fear. Not exactly. More like the sense that something important had just crossed into her life. Grace tightened her grip on her cane and continued toward home, completely unaware that somewhere beyond the trees, a man feared by an entire kingdom had just taken his first step toward her small cabin. That night, the storm arrived without warning. Grace heard it long before the first drops touched the roof of her cabin. Wind swept through the forest with a restless voice, bending branches and rattling leaves against one another. By the time darkness settled across Pine Hollow, rain was falling steadily. Grace sat near the fireplace with a blanket draped over her shoulders and a book resting unopened in her lap. She could not read the pages, but she often traced the worn cover because it had belonged to her mother. The familiar texture brought comfort on lonely evenings. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. The sound echoed through the valley before fading into the distance. Grace listened quietly. Most people disliked storms. She found them strangely peaceful. Rain made the world honest. It silenced distractions and revealed what truly mattered. Another gust of wind struck the cabin. Then she heard something unusual. At first, she thought it was a loose branch scraping against the porch. The sound came again. Slower this time. Deliberate. Footsteps. Grace straightened immediately. Her heart skipped once. Someone was outside. She set the book aside and stood. The footsteps approached the front door. Heavy. Uneven. Whoever it was seemed exhausted. For several seconds, silence followed. Then came a soft knock. Not forceful. Not demanding. Almost hesitant. Grace tightened her grip on the back of a nearby chair. Few people visited her cabin after dark. No one during a storm. Yet something about the knock felt different. She moved carefully toward the door. "Who is it?" she asked. The answer came after a pause. The voice was deep and rough, carrying a cold edge that made her pulse quicken. "I need shelter for the night." Grace had never heard the voice before. It belonged to a stranger. Rain continued pounding against the roof. She listened carefully. Beneath the man's words, she detected fatigue. And something else. Loneliness. "Are you from Pine Hollow?" she asked. "No." The reply was immediate. "Then where are you from?" Another pause followed. "Far away." Grace almost smiled despite her uncertainty. Whoever he was, he clearly did not enjoy answering questions. Most sensible people would have refused. A lone woman living in the forest had every reason to be cautious. Yet Grace remembered the unsteady footsteps she had heard earlier. She remembered the storm outside. And she remembered how often kindness appeared when people needed it most. Slowly she unlocked the door. Cool air rushed inside. Rain scented the darkness beyond the porch. The stranger stepped across the threshold. Instantly Grace sensed his presence. He was tall, much taller than most men in town. His movements were controlled despite obvious exhaustion. Water dripped from his coat onto the wooden floor. Neither spoke for a moment. "There are towels beside the fireplace," Grace said softly. "You can dry off. You are not afraid to let a stranger into your home." The question surprised her. His voice remained cold, but beneath it she heard genuine curiosity. Grace shrugged lightly. "Perhaps I should be." Silence lingered between them. Then the man gave a short laugh. It was not warm, more surprised than amused. "Perhaps." Grace closed the door behind him. Thunder shook the sky again. She moved toward the kitchen area and began preparing tea. The stranger remained near the entrance, watching, listening, measuring everything around him. She could feel it. "You can sit down," she said. "I do not bite." Another brief silence. Then she heard a chair slide across the floor. "Neither do I," he replied. The answer should have sounded reassuring. Instead, something about the way he said it made her wonder what kind of life he had lived. As water heated on the stove, Grace listened to the storm and the quiet breathing of the man sitting across the room. She could not see his face. She could not know that his name was Sebastian Thorne. She could not know that kingdoms feared him and powerful leaders obeyed his commands. All she knew was that a stranger had arrived during a storm carrying a sadness almost as heavy as the rain outside. By morning, the storm had passed, but the stranger remained. Grace knew at the moment she opened her eyes. Long before she heard movement, she sensed another presence inside the cabin. The air felt different, less empty. She sat up slowly and listened. A chair creaked somewhere near the fireplace. Then came the faint sound of pages turning. The stranger was awake. For reasons she could not explain, that realization brought an unexpected sense of comfort. She rose from bed and followed the familiar path toward the kitchen. "Good morning," she said. Silence lingered for a second. "Morning." His voice sounded calmer than it had the night before. Still guarded. Still distant. Yet no longer as cold. Grace smiled slightly and reached for a kettle. "You are still here. The roads are flooded." That sounds like an excuse. Another pause followed. Then, unexpectedly, she heard a low chuckle. It was brief, but real. The sound surprised both of them. As breakfast cooked, the cabin filled with the scent of bread and coffee. Grace moved comfortably through the space while the stranger observed in silence. He noticed how she counted steps without thinking, how she located every item by touch, how she never hesitated despite being unable to see. Most people would have viewed her blindness first. Somehow Grace made it seem secondary to everything else she was. "You live alone?" he finally asked. "I do." "Has no one offered to help?" Grace spread jam across a slice of bread. "People offer help all the time." "Then why stay alone?" She considered the question. "Because there is a difference between being cared for and being controlled." The stranger said nothing. Yet something in the room shifted. Grace could almost feel him studying her words. After breakfast, she prepared a basket for her weekly deliveries into town. The stranger remained near the door. "You should stay here," he said suddenly. "Why?" "The trails will be dangerous after the storm." Grace tilted her head. "You sound worried." "I am practical." She laughed softly. "Of course you are." Together they stepped outside. The forest smelled fresh and clean after the rain. Water dripped from branches overhead, while sunlight filtered through the trees. Grace listened to birds returning to their morning routines. Beside her, the stranger walked in silence. His footsteps were steady now, strong. Yet she noticed something unusual. Every time the path narrowed, he adjusted his pace to remain beside her. Every time roots crossed the trail, he quietly warned her. He did not announce his help or draw attention to it. He simply made sure she stayed safe. By the time they reached Pine Hollow, people had started noticing. Conversations softened as Grace passed. Several residents greeted her politely before lowering their voices. Outsiders rarely visited the town, especially outsiders like him. His presence carried an undeniable intensity. Children stopped playing to watch him pass. Shopkeepers glanced toward him before quickly looking away. Grace noticed the reactions immediately. People seem nervous around you. Perhaps they are cautious. Have you always had that effect on people? This time the silence lasted longer. Yes. Something about the answer made her smile. Later that afternoon, while helping organize supplies at the community center, Grace overheard a conversation between two merchants nearby. Their voices carried easily through the room. "Have you heard?" one asked. "The Alpha King is missing." Grace paused. "Missing?" the second merchant replied. "That is what they are saying. Vanished several days ago. The entire kingdom is searching for him." A chill ran through the room despite the warm afternoon. The Alpha King. Even Grace knew the stories. Ruthless, powerful, feared across every territory. The kind of man ordinary people discussed only in whispers. "Imagine meeting someone like that," one merchant said. "I would rather not." Grace smiled faintly and continued sorting supplies. Across town, standing quietly beneath the shade of a large oak tree, the stranger listened to the same conversation. His expression never changed. Yet as his gaze drifted toward the building where Grace worked, he found himself thinking something he had not allowed himself to think in a very long time. For the first time in years, he was not in a hurry to leave. The following evening arrived with a quiet calm that seemed almost unnatural after the storm. Grace sat on the small wooden porch outside her cabin, listening to the forest settle beneath the fading light. Crickets had begun their evening chorus. Somewhere nearby, a creek moved gently over smooth stones. The familiar sounds wrapped around her like an old blanket. Beside her, the stranger sat in silence. Over the past 2 days, she had grown accustomed to his presence. He spoke little, yet somehow the cabin no longer felt empty. It surprised her how quickly a person could become part of a routine. "You are thinking too hard again," she said. A soft breeze moved through the trees. "How would you know?" he asked. Grace smiled. "Because when you are quiet, your breathing changes." The answer earned another brief silence. Then she heard him shift slightly in his chair. "You notice everything." "Not everything." She tilted her head toward the sound of the forest. "Just the things people forget to hide." For a moment neither spoke. The air carried the scent of pine and damp earth. Somewhere in the distance an owl called. Grace leaned back against the porch railing. "Can I ask you something?" "You usually do." She laughed softly. "Fair point." The stranger remained waiting. "Have you always traveled alone?" she asked. His answer did not come immediately. "Mostly." "That sounds lonely." "Sometimes." Grace turned her face toward him. She could not see his expression, but she could hear something in his voice she had not noticed before. Weariness. Not physical exhaustion. Something deeper. The kind that accumulated over years. "I think loneliness is different from being alone," she said quietly. "What is the difference?" "Being alone is where you are. Loneliness is who you think cares whether you come back." The forest seemed to grow quieter after she spoke. The stranger did not answer for several seconds. When he finally did, his voice was lower than before. "That is a very specific observation." Grace shrugged. "I have had time to think about it." Inside the cabin, a kettle began to whistle. She rose and moved toward the door. Instantly, she heard the stranger stand as well. "Careful," he said. "The porch step." Grace smiled. "You know, I managed perfectly well before you arrived. That does not mean I should stop reminding you." Something warm settled inside her chest. It had been a long time since someone worried about her without treating her like a burden. Later that night, they sat beside the fireplace sharing tea. The cabin glowed with soft golden light. Outside, darkness wrapped itself around the forest. Grace listened to the crackling logs while the stranger remained unusually thoughtful. Finally, she broke the silence. Today I heard more stories about the missing Alpha King. The room became completely still. Grace noticed immediately. Apparently, he is terrifying. No response. People say entire territories fear him. Still nothing. One merchant claimed he can silence a room with a single look. Across from her, the stranger stared into the fire. People exaggerate. Grace laughed. That sounds suspiciously defensive. Or realistic. Would you be afraid of him? She asked. The question lingered between them. Fear is often based on incomplete information, he said at last. Grace considered that. That sounds like something a dangerous person would say. Unexpectedly, she heard him laugh. A genuine laugh this time. Deep, brief, real. The sound surprised her enough that she smiled without realizing it. For several minutes afterward, neither spoke. Yet the silence felt different now. Easier. Comfortable. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees. Inside, two people sat beside a fire while the distance between strangers slowly disappeared. And for the first time in many years, Sebastian Thorne found himself wishing the night would last a little longer. The next few days settled into a rhythm neither of them acknowledged aloud. Each morning Grace woke to the sound of someone already moving around the cabin. Sometimes it was the scrape of a chair across the floor. Sometimes it was the soft crackle of a fire being prepared before dawn. Once, it was the scent of fresh coffee waiting for her before she even left her room. The stranger never mentioned these small acts of kindness. He simply did them. And somehow, that made them matter more. Grace found herself smiling more often. The silence that had once filled her home no longer felt heavy. It felt shared. One afternoon, they walked together along a narrow trail that wound through the forest beyond Pine Hollow. Sunlight filtered through the trees while birds sang overhead. Grace moved carefully with her cane, listening to the familiar sounds around her. Beside her, the stranger matched her pace without being asked. You know, Grace said, most people assume I need someone guiding me everywhere. Do you? He asked. No. Then they are wrong. She laughed softly. That was a very quick answer. Not every question requires a long one. The simplicity of his response warmed her unexpectedly. Most people either pitted her blindness or admired her for overcoming it. Very few simply accepted it as part of who she was. He seemed to belong to that rare group. They continued walking until they reached a small clearing overlooking the valley. Grace could not see the view, but she knew the place well. The breeze always felt different there. Wider. Freer. She sat on a fallen log while the stranger remained nearby. For a while neither spoke. Then Grace asked the question that had been lingering in her mind for days. What are you running from? Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. Thoughtful silence. The kind that arrived before an honest answer. Why do you think I am running? He finally asked. Grace smiled faintly. Because every time someone asks where you came from, you change the subject. The stranger exhaled slowly. Perhaps I simply value privacy. That is possible. She tilted her head slightly. But it is not the real reason. He found himself staring at her. It remained astonishing how often she understood things without seeing them. And what do you think the real reason is? He asked. Grace considered the question. I think something happened that made it difficult for you to trust people. The words struck closer than she realized. Sebastian looked away toward the distant mountains. In another life, surrounded by advisors and soldiers, nobody spoke to him like this. Nobody looked beyond the title. Nobody cared enough to ask why he carried so much weight on his shoulders. Yet Grace did, without knowing who he was, without expecting anything in return. The realization both comforted and frightened him. Because over the past few days he had discovered something impossible to ignore. His instincts responded to her differently. His attention always drifted toward her. Her voice calmed him in ways that made no sense. And every hour he spent near her made leaving more difficult. He already knew what it meant. She was his mate. The realization had arrived quietly, growing stronger each day until denial became impossible. Yet he had told her nothing. How could he? If Grace learned that the man sharing her home was the Alpha King everyone feared, she might never speak to him the same way again. She might stop laughing, stop teasing him, stop treating him like an ordinary man. And somehow, that possibility bothered him more than any political crisis waiting beyond the forest. "You are quiet again," Grace said gently. Sebastian blinked. "I was thinking. Dangerous habit." A reluctant smile appeared on his face. "Apparently." Grace laughed, and the sound carried through the clearing like music. For a brief moment, Sebastian allowed himself to imagine a future where he did not have to hide. A future where he could tell her the truth. Then the feeling vanished as quickly as it came. Because far beyond Pine Hollow, riders were already searching every road, every village, and every corner of the kingdom. And sooner or later, someone would find him. 3 more days passed, and with each sunrise the world beyond Pine Hollow seemed to grow louder. Grace noticed it first in the conversations around town. Everywhere she went, people spoke about the search. Merchants discussed it while unloading supplies. Farmers mentioned it over morning coffee. Even children repeated fragments of stories they barely understood. The missing Alpha King had become the only topic anyone seemed interested in. Grace stood near the counter of the general store one afternoon while waiting for a loaf of bread to cool. 2 travelers had arrived earlier that morning, bringing fresh rumors from neighboring territories. "The Royal Council has doubled the search teams," one man said. "They have riders covering every major road." Someone claimed they found a clue near the eastern border, another replied. If that is true, they could locate him any day now. Grace listened quietly. Beside her, the stranger remained silent. Over the past week, they had fallen into an easy rhythm. He accompanied her into town more often now. Nobody questioned it anymore. People had simply accepted that the intimidating outsider seemed determined to stay close to the blind Omega. Grace found the arrangement comforting, even if she rarely admitted it aloud. As they left the store together, she noticed something unusual. His footsteps sounded different. Tighter somehow. More focused. "You are worried," she said. The stranger stopped. "What makes you think that?" "Your breathing changes when something is bothering you." A soft breeze moved through the trees surrounding the road. "You pay too much attention." Grace smiled. "Someone has to." They continued walking toward the cabin. For a while neither spoke. Then Grace heard distant hoofbeats somewhere far away. Riders. Several of them. The sound faded quickly, but not before she noticed the stranger's pace slow ever so slightly. "More search teams?" she asked. "Probably." His answer came too quickly. Grace frowned. Something felt wrong. Not dangerous. Just strange. Over the past few days, she had begun noticing small details she had previously ignored. The stranger always knew more than he should. He understood politics despite claiming to be an ordinary traveler. He carried himself with unusual confidence. People instinctively moved aside when he walked through crowded spaces. Most curious of all, he never seemed surprised by news concerning the Alpha King. That evening they sat on the porch as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Grace listened to the forest settling into darkness. Beside her, the stranger remained unusually quiet. "Can I ask another question?" she said. "You rarely wait for permission." "True." A faint smile touched her lips. "Do you know someone important?" Silence. "Then, why would you ask that?" "Because whenever people discuss the Alpha King, you act like someone who has met him." The stillness that followed answered more than words could. Grace tilted her head slightly. That was not a denial. The stranger exhaled slowly. "No." Her curiosity deepened. Was he really as frightening as people claim? For several seconds, only the sound of wind moved between them. Then he said something she did not expect. "Most people fear what they do not understand." Grace considered that answer carefully. "You keep saying things like that." "Like what?" "Like someone defending him." The stranger laughed softly, but there was little humor in it. "Maybe I know more of the story than they do." Darkness deepened around the cabin. Somewhere beyond the forest, a distant horn echoed through the valley. Once, then again. The sound carried farther than any ordinary signal. The stranger immediately rose to his feet. Grace heard the sudden movement and felt her pulse quicken. "What is it?" she asked. He remained silent, listening. Far away, more hoofbeats answered the horn. Many more. Riders were approaching Pine Hollow from every direction. And for the first time since arriving at her cabin, the stranger sounded genuinely troubled. "It seems," he said quietly, "that someone finally found what they were looking for." The horn sounded again shortly after dawn. This time it came from much closer. Grace sat upright in bed immediately, her pulse already racing before she fully woke. The cabin felt different. Tense. expectant. Outside, she could hear movement throughout the forest. Not animals. Horses. Many of them. Voices drifted through the trees, distant but growing nearer with every passing minute. She rose quickly and stepped into the main room. The stranger was already awake. She recognized the steady rhythm of his footsteps near the front window. Neither spoke at first. The silence between them felt heavier than usual. "They found Pine Hollow," Grace said quietly. "Yes." His answer came immediately. No surprise. No confusion. As though he had expected this moment all along. Grace folded her arms. "You knew they were searching this area?" Another pause. "I suspected." Before she could ask more, the sound of hooves echoed directly outside the cabin. Several horses stopped near the porch. Doors opened. Boots struck the ground. The forest suddenly became crowded with activity. Grace felt her heart pound. Whoever had arrived was important. Very important. A sharp knock landed against the front door. The stranger closed his eyes briefly. Then he walked toward the entrance. Grace listened carefully. The door opened. Instantly, the outside noises stopped. Not faded. Stopped. As though dozens of people had fallen silent at once. Then a voice spoke. "Your Majesty." Grace froze. The words echoed through the cabin. For a moment she thought she had misheard. "Your Majesty." Another voice followed. "The council has been searching for you across the entire kingdom." Silence. Then the stranger answered. "I am aware." Grace could not breathe. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table beside her. The voice was unmistakable. The same voice that had shared meals with her. The same voice that had walked beside her through the forest. The same voice that had laughed quietly beside the fireplace only days ago. Outside, another man spoke. "The capital awaits your return, Your Majesty." Grace heard movement on the porch. Metal armor shifted softly. Fabric rustled. Then came something even more shocking. One after another, people lowered themselves to the ground. She recognized the sound immediately. Dozens of individuals kneeling at the same time. Respect. Loyalty. Obedience. Not toward a noble. Not toward a governor. Toward a king. Inside the cabin, the world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Memories rushed together all at once. The way people moved aside when he entered town. The way he always knew more than he should. The strange answers whenever she mentioned the Alpha King. The silence. The secrecy. The careful distance he maintained whenever conversations came too close to the truth. Suddenly everything made sense. Too much sense. Grace. His voice sounded different now. Not colder. Not harsher. Simply honest. For the first time, she took a step backward. Then another. Her thoughts struggled to catch up with reality. "You." The word barely escaped her lips. "You are the Alpha King." No answer came immediately. He did not deny it. He did not explain it away. Finally, he said the only thing he could. "Yes." The simple admission struck harder than any dramatic revelation could have. Grace lowered her head. Not because she could see the floor. Because she needed something stable to focus on. Every conversation. Every shared meal. Every moment beside the fire suddenly carried an entirely different meaning. The man she had treated like an ordinary traveler was the ruler of the Northern Territory. The most feared Alpha in the kingdom. Outside, the soldiers remained waiting. No one dared interrupt. The cabin felt impossibly small. "Why did you not tell me?" she asked softly. The question carried no anger. Only hurt. Sebastian stepped closer, though carefully. "Because when you spoke to me, you spoke to a person." His voice lowered. Not a title. Grace felt her throat tighten. Outside stood soldiers. Advisors. An entire kingdom searching for its missing ruler. Yet all she could think about was the man who had made coffee before sunrise and warned her about roots crossing a forest path. And as silence settled between them once more, Grace realized that the greatest surprise was not discovering who he truly was. It was realizing how much his absence would hurt if he left. The cabin remained silent long after the soldiers arrived. Outside, horses shifted occasionally, armor moved softly, and distant voices exchanged careful instructions. Inside, however, nothing seemed to exist except Grace and Sebastian. The truth stood between them now, impossible to ignore. Grace sat slowly in the chair beside the table, trying to make sense of everything she had learned. For days she had shared her home with a stranger. For days she had trusted him, laughed with him, and listened to the quiet sadness hidden beneath his voice. Now she knew that voice belonged to the Alpha King. The realization should have changed everything. Yet somehow it did not change the things that mattered most. Sebastian remained standing nearby. For perhaps the first time in his life, he seemed uncertain. Grace could hear it in the way he shifted his weight. She could hear it in the silence he struggled to break. "You should have told me," she said at last. Her voice was calm, but the disappointment within it was impossible to miss. Sebastian lowered his gaze. "I know. Did you ever intend to?" Another pause followed. "Every day." Grace frowned slightly. "Then why did you not?" Sebastian looked toward the window where morning light filtered through the glass. "Because every day I waited became another day when you spoke to me honestly." The answer caught her off guard. "What does that mean?" "People treat kings differently." His voice was quiet now, honest in a way she had never heard before. "They tell me what they think I want to hear. They become careful, formal, distant." He hesitated. "You never did." Grace sat silently. Sebastian continued. "You argued with me, teased me, questioned me." A faint smile touched his voice. "You treated me like a man instead of a title." Something tightened inside her chest. She remembered every conversation, every joke, every moment beside the fireplace. None of those memories felt false. Yet the secret still hurt. "I trusted you," she whispered. "I know." The simplicity of his answer somehow made it worse. For several moments neither spoke. Then Grace heard movement outside. More people had arrived. Important people by the sound of it. Their voices carried authority. Advisors, officials, members of the royal court. The entire kingdom seemed to be gathering around her little cabin. "They need you," she said quietly. Sebastian did not answer immediately. "Perhaps." Grace tilted her head toward him. "You are their king. And you are the reason I stayed." The words landed with surprising weight. Grace forgot how to respond. Sebastian rarely spoke about emotions. Most of the time she had to guess what he felt. Yet this time there was no misunderstanding. No hidden meaning. Just truth. Outside, someone approached the porch. A respectful knock sounded against the door. "Your Majesty," a voice called. "The council requests your presence." Sebastian closed his eyes briefly. The moment he had been avoiding had finally arrived. Grace heard him exhale slowly. Then he walked toward the door. For a second she thought he might leave without another word. Instead, his footsteps stopped directly in front of her. "Grace." Her heart immediately quickened. "Yes. Everything I told you about loneliness was true." His voice was steady. "Everything I felt in this house was real." The room seemed smaller somehow. Warmer. More fragile. Grace swallowed hard. "Sebastian." For the first time, she spoke his name. Not Your Majesty. Not Alpha King. Just Sebastian. The silence that followed felt almost sacred. Then another knock came from outside. More urgent this time. Reality had returned. Duties. Responsibilities. The kingdom waiting beyond the forest. Sebastian stepped back. Grace listened as he moved toward the door. The handle turned. Morning sounds flooded into the cabin. Soldiers. Horses. Advisors. An entire world reclaiming its ruler. Yet before he crossed the threshold, he stopped one final time. "I will come back," he said softly. Then he stepped outside. And as dozens of voices immediately greeted their king, Grace sat alone in the cabin, listening to the man she had grown to care about disappear into the life he had tried so hard to escape. Weeks passed after Sebastian returned to the capital. For Grace, the forest slowly regained its familiar rhythm, but nothing felt quite the same. Each morning she still woke before sunrise. She still listened to the creek beyond the trees and the birds greeting the dawn. Yet now another sound seemed missing. The quiet footsteps that used to move through her cabin before she awoke. The deep voice that always appeared beside her during evening walks. She told herself life was returning to normal. The problem was that normal no longer felt enough. News from the capital arrived frequently. Travelers spoke of the Alpha King's return. Merchants discussed council meetings, royal ceremonies, and celebrations across the territory. Everyone seemed relieved that their ruler had been found. Grace listened politely and continued with her daily routine. She never mentioned that she knew him. She never told anyone that the terrifying Alpha King preferred strong coffee before sunrise, or that he laughed when she teased him. Those memories remained hers alone. Then, one bright autumn morning, Pine Hollow erupted into excitement. Horses entered town. Carriages followed. Important visitors had arrived. Grace heard the commotion from outside her cabin long before someone knocked on her door. When she opened it, she recognized the voice immediately. It belonged to one of the royal advisors she had heard outside the cabin weeks earlier. "Miss Bennet," the man said respectfully, "His Majesty requests your presence." Grace's heart nearly stopped. Several hours later, she found herself traveling toward the capital. The journey felt unreal. She had never imagined leaving Pine Hollow, much less entering the royal city. When the carriage finally stopped, countless sounds surrounded her. Fountains, music, distant conversations. The capital seemed alive in a way she had never experienced. Guided carefully through the palace grounds, Grace followed the advisor into a vast courtyard. Hundreds of people had gathered. Nobles, officials, members of the royal court. Their voices filled the air. Confused, Grace stopped walking. "What is happening?" she asked quietly. Before the advisor could answer, another voice spoke. One she would have recognized anywhere. "Something I should have done honestly from the beginning." The courtyard fell silent. Grace felt her pulse quicken. Sebastian stood only a few feet away. She could hear it in his voice, feel it in the stillness surrounding him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he approached. Slowly, deliberately. The crowd watched every step. "When I arrived at your cabin, I was running from responsibilities I could not escape," he said. "You gave me something I had not found in years. Peace." Grace felt emotion rising in her chest. Sebastian continued. "You treated me with kindness when you believed I was nobody important. You trusted me before you knew my title. And you reminded me that a crown does not matter if the person wearing it forgets who he is." The courtyard remained silent. Grace could hear people holding their breath. Then something unexpected happened. The Alpha King lowered himself onto one knee. Gasps echoed from every direction. Nobles stared in disbelief. Advisors exchanged stunned looks. Throughout the kingdom, people knelt before their king. Yet now their king knelt before a blind Omega from a small forest town. Sebastian's voice remained steady. "Grace Bennet, I came to your cabin as a stranger. I leave my pride behind as a man asking for a chance." His words softened. "Will you stand beside me and help me build a future neither of us has to face alone?" Tears filled Grace's eyes. For a second, she could not speak. She thought about lonely mornings, shared conversations beside the fire, forest walks, honest laughter. The man she had cared about had never truly disappeared. He was standing right in front of her. Slowly, a smile touched her face. "Yes," she whispered. The single word carried farther than any speech. Cheers erupted across the courtyard. Yet Grace barely heard them. Because in that moment, surrounded by an entire kingdom, all she could focus on was the familiar warmth in Sebastian's voice. And for the first time since losing her sight years ago, the future felt brighter than anything she could have imagined.